Good afternoon, everybody. So I'd like to, first, there is an announcement. We cannot take questions from participants in webinar. Only take the questions for this session only from the floor, or participant on the floor. So I'm sorry about that. But next session, session 3, and the last discussion session, we can actually take questions from audience. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce the chair of the second session of the day, titled World War II and Its Consequences. It is my pleasure to introduce session chair, Dr. Yuma Otani. She is professor of history at the University of Hawaii, teaching courses on modern Japan. Dr. Otani's research monograph include the Tokyo War Crimes Trial, the Pursuit of Justice in the Wake of World War II from Harvard University Press, and Justice in Asia and the Pacific Region, 1945-1952 from Cambridge University Press. Since 2017, she has supported the Japanese Diaspora Initiative and promoted World War II research in her capacity as a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution. Without further ado.
Thank you. It is my pleasure to chair this session, session 2. And let me introduce our first speaker, Mr. Shinya Yoshida. He is a PhD candidate in the Department of History at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. The title of his presentation, as you already see on the slide on the screen, is From American Orientals to We, the East Asian Races, ? Japanese Americans, Chinese and China from 1931.
All right, let's get started. I'm Shinya Yoshida, a PhD candidate of the History Department of pronouns are he, his, him. I'm studying the history of Asian Americans, U.S. immigrations, race, nationalism, the U.S. East Asian relations, etc., etc. I'm honored to be here today because I have a chance to expose myself to the cutting-edge scholars or PhD students of Japanese diaspora studies. Before beginning my presentations, I would like to apologize to you for confusing you about my presentation's abstract shared with you in advance. As some of you might notice, there is a typo of unnecessary words of second international workshop inserted in this paragraph. So sorry for my blunder. Now that I'm done with brief self-introduction and era, let's dive into my presentation titled From American Orientals to the East Asian Races, the Japanese American, Chinese, and China from 1931 to 1942. Amid the Second Sino-Japanese War, one Japanese immigrant in San Francisco posted a short column. It says, "We are mutually dependent, same culture, same race. Chinese folk, we are neighbors. Let's be friends forever." These expressions like same race, friends, drew my attention, not only because they often appears in Japanese communities related historical documents, but also because Chinese immigrants were prejudiced by Japanese in the process of their community making. In my presentations, I would like to delve into the implication of Japanese Americans' views about Chinese and China. The term Japanese American adopts here broader definitions. Japanese migrants, they are US-born children, and Japanese people that are deeply engaged in the communities of Japanese America. Previously, a lot of research has been done about Japanese migrants' history. To name a few frameworks and themes relevant to my research, they are transnational global history of Japanese migrant settlers, Asian American studies with Asian studies, and untold 1930s in Japanese American history, as addressed by Professor Yasuo Sakata. When it comes to Japanese migrants in the interwar period, we now know that overseas Japanese communities supported Imperial Japan's invasion of China, a central battlefield of Japan up until the end of World War II. But I think the question of how they viewed China awaits further investigations. My presentation explores Japanese Americans' connection to interaction with observation of Chinese and China before the Pacific War. Okay, today's outline is as follows. I'm done with introduction. So Japanese American on the West Coast and the experience in and connection to China, and last not but least, conclusions. Let me begin with the timeline of major incidents related to these presentations. Perhaps there's no need for this because these incidents are well known, but just to be on the safe side. In 1922, the Great Depressions, 1931, a skirmish that happened in China called the Boston Incident, which paved the way of the building of Japan's puppet state in northeast China. In the same year, Japanese military action was a pretext for protecting Japanese monk from Chinese happened in Shanghai, now what we call the Shanghai Incident. And 1933, Japan's withdrawal from the League of Nations. In 1937, the second time Japanese War. And 1941, the beginning of the Pacific War. With these incidents in mind, let's take a look at Japanese Americans on the West Coast, especially California. It is well known that Chinese and Japanese were treated as racial minorities, as is encapsulated with the terms such as Orientals, alien ineligible citizenship, etc. They had no rights to vote. Their welfare was severely restricted in the realm of housing, education, employment, and the list goes on and on. In the sense of racial status, we can say that both groups shared a common denominator. In the meantime, their homeland relationship was deteriorating because of Japan's invasion of China, like I mentioned earlier, the Mukden incident and Shanghai incident. Interlocking with East Asian anti-Japan, pro-China sentiments were growing in America. Denouncing Japan's military action, humanitarian aid for China were prevalent. Chinese communities were earnestly engaged with propaganda and boycotting Japanese goods. The picture is a clipping from Japanese community newspaper that conveys Chinese communities anti-Japan marching San Francisco in 1931. And the other photo shows that Chinese American youngsters picketing Japanese shops in San Francisco. The right boy held a sign that says, "Don't buy goods made in Japan." The left female looks a bit perplexed. These settings were all combined to shape Japanese American mindset toward Chinese and China. At around this time, Japanese communities has a lot of thoughts on China. In the eyes of Japanese Americans, China is a great nation of huge population and abundant natural resources. And attractive for them is the prospective market. In spite of, because of these positive views, Japanese Americans often asserted that China is in a state of chaos and stagnation. Why? First, it is because of no legitimate central government in China. For them, Chiang Kai-shek is just another warlord. Secondly, in relation to that, they saw Chiang Kai-shek as a major propagator of anti-Japan sentiments because he was implementing anti-Japan education policy in China. Third, Chiang Kai-shek was too dependent on Europe and America as an arbitrator of Sino-Japan issues, being backed up by a huge amount. Lastly, the last factor is geographical exposure to Soviet Russia's communism. In order to fill in this political cleavage between China and Japan, the 1930s saw the blooming of nationalism, Japanese community. To a bit elaborate, as Yoshimi Takeuchi, a prominent Japanese scholar of Asian studies, said it's almost impossible to define pan-Asian because the tenets vary so much according to the ideologues. For the time being, I use this term to refer ideology actions in search of Asian solidarity. What informs this ideology is the future vision of Japan-centered Asian unity. The expression below, like Japan-Sino goodwill, Nichu Shinzen, Japan-Sino cooperations, Nichu Kyoryoku, take care, Japan-Sino coexistence and co-prosperity, to Kyozon-Kyoe and Asia or East Asia Monroe Doctrine. These terms all exemplified Pan-Asianism discourse. This short essay is a case in point. Sorry for missing the date and year of publication. It is September 18th in 1932. In the context of criticizing naive Japanese followers of Euro-American thoughts in Japan, this argues return back to Japan is crucial for Japanese futures. These days, let's realize the great Asianism by guiding China, Siam, Southeast Asian islands, and the colored race of India after organizing and Manchukuo. Of note here is that Japanese American came to push forward the racial facets of Pan-Asianism. In Japanese language primary sources, including newspapers, racial vocabulary such as yellow race, Towa means East Asian races frequently appear. But especially drew my attention is repeatedly articulated expression dobun doshu. Speaking of the etymology, do means same or more common. Bun is a bit complex because it has a multi meanings like civilization, culture, language, etc. And last but not least, should means a race. In the eyes of Japanese Americans, how to communicate with Chinese became more and more crucial. Japanese came to see Chinese as a showcase to put Pan-Asianism into practice. Now let's look at Japanese Americans' approach to Chinese Americans. Japanese in America often called Chinese Shinsan. This is a Japanese immigrant specific way of calling Chinese. So what we say that, well, as it's discussed in the last section, that I guess this is one of the and the to me this is Japanese immigrant specific way of calling Chinese. To me, it sounds a sarcastic language with a nuance of a bit of respect. That implies their mixed feelings toward Chinese. On the one hand, they have a racialized negative image like sanitary, immoral, assimilable. On the other hand, positive image has been around, like China's long history, civilizations, industrious workers, and cultural richness, and the fact that China kept sovereignty in the age of imperialism. From the 1930s, Japanese American came to cover up these negative racial aspects and address the sameness as Chinese. Here's an example of Japanese Americans' racially approach to Chinese communities. I believe that Japanese and Chinese should have friendship and cooperate with each other, even in foreign countries. We are brothers and sisters of same culture, same race, who built the states in East Asia. Thus, the action that foreign countries take against Japanese are not only Imperial Japan issue, but also issues that fall on East Asia. The Alien Land Bill and the discriminatory fishery bill in America are never Japanese-only issues. We should solve this problem in cooperation with each other. Here, I want to briefly bring your attention to Chinese reaction to Japan-led Pan-Asianism. In a short column titled "Little Japan Built the Great East Asia," this is clipping from the Junsai Yapo, the one of the most popular daily Chinese community newspaper circulated in America. And the author says East Asia is East Asia for East Asia. It's never Japanese East Asia. If you wish to build the Great East Asia, it must be built by East Asian races. As is obvious from this short column, Chinese were intensely against Japan-led Pan-Asia. In the latter half of my presentations, I'd like to mention Japanese Americans' connection to experience in China to elaborate on my argument. In China, of course, Chinese as Han race are majority national, but they were put under unequal power relationship by foreign imperialism. For example, foreign concessions, what we say in the Chinese, the colonies like Hong Kong, Macau, and wartime occupied zones, mainly by Imperial Japan. In these settings, who among Japanese Americans had a connection with China on the ground level? In what capacity? There are the Buddhist, Christian, traveler, merchants, and entrepreneur, intellectual, journalists, and war correspondents, US-born Japan soldiers, bankers, students, I want to share with you my finding that I felt interesting. I have no idea of this author's real name, but this Kyushu Danji looks back on his visit to Canton and communication with local Chinese in nostalgic tone. He posted his song, Asia Monroe Doctrine song. Interestingly, lyric is, "Oh, water of Heilong." Heilong is named place in North China. The snow of Mountain Fuji, they melt and flew into Asian race. They will be the blood of same roots, same race. By this song, this Kyushu Danji tried to promote Japan's advancement to Asia. The next case is Kunio Kodaira. He once served as a pastor of San Francisco Japanese Christian Church and then returned to Japan. Right after the Muslim incident in 1931, he was touring America to deliver the lecture of Sino-Japan issues. Although the detail of his experiences in China needs more investigations, he said, "I visited China 5-6 times to promote friendship. Now Japan and China are waging a war because of the Muslim incident. Both countries of same culture, same race must cooperate with each other for building East Asian culture. China says Japan is militarism and invasionism, but that's not true." His pan-Asianism orientation made him publish Asia for Asia. This was published in 1974. He asserts in this book, in his capacity as a Christian, that white racism violence towards the colored race contradicts the Christian spirit. After the publication of Asia for Asia, he kept visiting China, such as Dalian in Chinese, Dalian, in 1936. Example of Japanese Americans' connection to experience in China go on and on. I happened to stumble upon the several cases of Japanese Americans who had a connection to Shanghai, the New York of East Asia. In Shanghai, many racist nationals from Europe and Asia lived together. Plus, unfortunately, Chinese were discriminated against by them. Saki Shimazu, a Japanese Christian living in Chicago for 30 years, left to Shanghai to serve as Shanghai Japanese YMCA chief. According to him, Chinese students approached him to learn Japanese. Saki Shimazu conveyed his joy to the contribution to international goodwill friendship between Chinese and Japanese. Let me add the case of Mugen Suzuki, a Japanese who moved from California to Shanghai. He's an intriguing guy. Before migrating to Shanghai, he suggested that Nisei should go to central China under the strong influence of Euro-America. This is because Nisei's English proficiency will help find a job more easily. Mugen Suzuki believed that Nisei as Dobun Doshu, same culture, same race of Chinese, should promote Sino-Japan friendship and thereby should be the bridge between Euro-America, China, and Japan. After starting living in Shanghai, he was faced with the reality of Sino-Japan mutual misunderstanding. Nevertheless, Suzuki kept arguing that we, Japan, the leader of Asia, should help China awake and should get trust from China. And this is my final slide for conclusion. Just to be sure, today's presentation does not cover all aspects of Japanese Americans' view on Chinese and China. Actually, I stumbled upon many cases of Japanese Americans in other parts of China as capacity, like wartime correspondence or student or or Imperial Japan. So yeah, there are many rooms for further investigation. While keeping various, a bit of shortcomings in mind, I'd like to conclude my presentation with my argument that pan-Asianism is in the language of the racial solidarity and friendship loomed large among Japanese Americans in the 1930s as a lens for viewing China and Chinese in the context of worsening Sino-Japanese political relations. And thank you for listening.
Our next speaker is Dr. Hiroyuki Shibata. He received his PhD in sociology from the Graduate Center, City University of New York, and is an independent researcher. The title of his presentation is Two Trajectories of Diasporic Engagement, a comparative study of intergroup conflicts among Japanese migrants in Brazil in the aftermath of World War II.
Good afternoon, everyone. Before starting in my presentation, I have a logistic announcement for online. I have an appendix for this presentation to help you to understand my presentation. So, and then appendix is on the workshop website, and then right below the title of my presentation. So please visit the workshop website and then download the appendix. That might help you to understand some data. And then the appendix includes the maps and graphs and some citations. So okay. Let's start my presentation. Okay. So I'm going to start this talk with the two contrasting interpretations of the Emperor of Japan as the nationalistic symbol for Japanese immigrants in Japan, in Brazil. As many of you know, Hachimaki conflicts are introduced conflicts among Japanese migrants in Brazil over the defeat of Japan in World War II. The existing studies on this issue have emphasized Japanese cultural values shared by Japanese migrants as the major factor of the rise of Kachigumi, those who denied Japan's defeat. And they argue, existing studies argue that the rise and spread of deniers is a prominent manifestation of durable diasporic nationalism. However, not only did the deniers Kachigumi, but also those who accepted the defeat, Makegumi, also employed the emperor as a symbol for legitimizing their claim. The appendix that I provided separately shows that the deniers and acceptors appears respectively. So the fact that both deniers and acceptors employ the same symbol poses an empirical puzzle. That is, why did acceptors fail to mobilize Japanese migrants, despite that they also appear to the same nationalist symbol? If deniers and acceptors share the same symbolism, how can cultural value explain the rise of conflicts among the two camps? And why are the conflicts intensified in some local communities, but not in others? In short, these questions cast doubt on the conventional understanding or conventional stories of Kachimaki conflicts that emphasize the causal significance of Japanese cultural values. Against this background, I'm going to pose following research questions. First, why and how two Japanese communities versus the register, which is the main focus of this study, differently respond to the conflicts. Second, which is a much more theoretical one, why and how does diasporic engagement rise and fall? I'm going to present my argument in advance. First, I'm going to argue that crystallization of the diaspora, crystallization of Japanese cultural values is not the cause, but a result of the conflict. Second, the retreat of the diaspora policies of Japan from Brazil offer the critical juncture for the dissolution of the Japanese exclaves. And the key to understanding varying responses to is the process of disjuncture between local economic and organizational basis of Japanese exclave after the retreat of diaspora policies of Japan. And finally, the empirical analysis versus in the register theoretically suggests causal mechanisms of the dissolution of diasporic engagement. So theoretical issues. Diasporic engagement is the migrants' transborder engagement with their homeland affairs. This notion is important from a theoretical perspective because my study theoretically engages with migrant transnationalism. So the pioneer studies in the early 1990s tend to understand migrant transnationalism as an ontological reality of migrants in the globalized era, as exemplified by the term for transmigrants coined by Blackshear and Harcourt. However, empirical consensus emerged afterwards. That is, migrants' transnational ties are not a new phenomenon. There are some historical cases as well. And only a few migrants are actively engaged in cross-border activities. Nevertheless, a question remains, why and how do some migrants more strongly commit to diaspora engagement than other migrants? To this question, the existing studies offer the individual level and the institutional factors. For individual level factors, they point to the length of time in host societies and the amount of resources that migrants have. For institutional factors, they suggest context of reception, diaspora processes of the sending state, and migrants' networks and organization. I'm not going to explain these factors in detail now, but I'm going to come back to these factors as the potential explanation factor in my case later. In addition to these factors, recent studies pay attention to the conjuncture causation that combines these factors and then resulting in varying outcomes. I also argue that not only does combination, but also the permutation, meaning that the temporal order of factors in the sequence matters to produce varying levels of diasporic engagement. However, in contrast to sizable number of studies on the emergence of diasporic engagement, few studies have examined its decline. To be clear, there are some studies on the decline. However, they are largely based on the assimilationist understanding of diasporic engagement. Namely, they argue that diasporic engagement is a transient phenomenon and destined to decline as migrants assimilate into the host society over time. Certainly, this long-term trend is not deniable in the case of Japanese migrants in Brazil. In the pre-war period, most Japanese migrants had membership in ethnic organizations such as Japanese community boards, Nihonjinkai, or agricultural cooperatives, but participation rate declined in the post-war period significantly. However, beyond this general trend decline, few studies examine variations of the declining pattern. So the theoretical question that this study addressed, why and how diasporic engagement declined, and what consequences are brought about when it declines. In this respect, Hachimaki conflicts offer interesting variation in the declining pattern. This study takes the Hachimaki conflict as a response to the dissolution of the diaspora exclave. Diaspora exclave can be characterized by three features. First, it is a migrant community, a high degree of institutional completeness that encompasses almost all aspects of migrants' life. Second, such institutional completeness is supported or reinforced by the diaspora process of the sending state, which process try to cultivate transport ties with nationals overseas by the sending state. And the third, the host state, in my case, Brazil, Brazilian government doesn't or cannot enforce active incorporated policies toward migrants. When these three conditions are met, diaspora exclave emerges, and its leaders can exercise the social control over members by the provision of what is called labicus, a specific type of public goods, access to which is unlimited to members. So in this respect, it is notable that the two particular Japanese exclaves, Basus in the register, you can see the location of these communities on the map in the appendix. These two communities demonstrated contrasting responses to Hachimaki conflicts. In Basus, the conflicts became intensified and resulted in a homicide and violent injuries, whereas in the register, the conflict remained latent despite the presence of deniers. So I asked why these communities demonstrated the contrasting responses. Now, I'm going to compare Bastos and the register. Bastos and the register are theoretically strategic in that they are most striking cases. The table here shows that the factors presented in existing studies. Those factors have good fit both with Bastos and the register. However, point is, Bastos and the register nevertheless demonstrated contrasting outcomes. First, a cultural argument. This is a baseline argument of empirical studies of Kachimaki conflicts. They point to the Japanese cultural barrier as a cause of the rise of deniers, Kachigumi. However, as mentioned earlier, both deniers and acceptors employ the same cultural symbol. In addition, the problem of culture argument is that researchers cannot directly observe inside people's mind. So existing empirical studies view the presence of collective events, such as birthday commemoration of the emperor, as the evidence of shared cultural values. However, people can participate in such event even without having cultural values in their mind. This is particularly so when community leaders can exercise social power over a neighbor through the provision of club goods. So instead of taking the presence of events as the evidence of the shared cultural values, we need to examine the institutional conditions of communities. In this respect, Bastos and register met the institutional conditions of diaspora excellently. First, both communities were supported by diaspora forces of Japan in the pre-war period. Second, both suffered from the restrictive forces of Brazil during the war period. And third, both Bastos and register developed informal networks among residents under the restrictive forces of Brazil. Additionally, both communities showed a similar level of distribution of the population. I'm going toward the individual level, which theoretical literature of diaspora engagement suggests to affect the level of diasporic engagement. Both of them and Bastos and register had a similar level of social differentiation among Japanese residents, meaning differentiation between landowners and renters. Moreover, both communities had a similar level of contact with native Brazilians. And finally, in terms of the general progression and decline of diasporic engagement, both Bastos and the register had a similar mixture of old and new migrants in the communities. So, all in all, Bastos and the register demonstrated similar parameters in all potential factors producing different levels of diaspora engagement. Nevertheless, Bastos and register showed different response to Kachimaki conflicts. Then we have to ask why. So this is the diagram that I think these two communities took the different paths to the Kachimaki conflict. So in the pre-war period, both Bastos and register were formed as a diaspora exclave, supported and reinforced by the diaspora forces. However, there was a difference between two communities. Bastos developed an export-oriented economy based on the cotton production. Figure 1 in the appendix, that is a graph, shows that the economy of Bastos heavily relied on the cotton production in the 1930s. In contrast, register struggled to establish the stable economic basis lacking of key agricultural products until late 30s. This difference in the economic basis is contingent on the agri-geographical condition. Bastos had a soil suitable for the cotton production, whereas register didn't. When the diaspora process in Japan supported both communities, this difference was not solid. But when the diaspora process retreated from Brazil in 1945, No, 40, 41, yeah. These two diaspora exclaves follow the divergent pathways. Along with the literature of diaspora process in Japan, Basso's economy rapidly suffered from stagnation. Figure 1 also shows that the cotton production rapidly declined when war began. So all in all, as Basso's economy underwent a downturn, leaders in Bassos lost their power of social control over the community members. Kachimaki conflict in Bassos occurred against this background of the disjunction between the economic and organizational basis. As a result, the conflict intensified to the extent that the community leaders calmed them down. In contrast, registry was not drastically affected by the retreat of the diaspora policies of Japan. Figure 2 in the appendix indicates agricultural revenue registry in the 1930s. It is notable that registry developed a horticulture production, shipping for Brazilian domestic market, as indicated by the sizable share of other categories in the figure. Under this economic condition, leaders of the registry, especially those of agriculture cooperative, could maintain and exercise social control through the provision of essential commodities, such as fertilizers, agricultural machineries, and more than anything, access to the distribution network to the Brazilian domestic market. Kachimaki conflicts in the registry occurred without disjunction between economic and organizational basis. Well, there are evidence that some residents in the registry believed Japan's victory, but the Kachimaki conflicts remained related to the registry. So conclusion. My study was motivated by two rationales: the overgeneralization of cultural values in the empirical literature, and then under-theorization of the decline of diasporic engagement in the theoretical literature. I treated Kachimaki conflict as a manifestation of the dissolution of diaspora exclaves and explored the causal mechanism of Kachimaki conflicts by comparing Basso's registry, which showed the contrasting responses to the conflicts. They are most likely cases that strategy to contribute to theory about the decline of diaspora engagement. So this study has both empirical and theoretical findings. Empirical ones. First, I found that the literature of Japanese diaspora policy from Brazil provided a critical juncture for the dissolution of the diaspora exclave. But second, the dissolution process diverged between Bassos and registry. Bassos experienced the rapid dissolution, and the legitimacy of the community leadership declined accordingly. In contrast, registry underwent the gradual resolution of diaspora exclave, with maintaining the leaders' legitimacy over the residents. So these findings lead us to some theoretical insights that can be useful for thinking about other cases. Theoretically speaking, I analyzed the conjunctural causation of the decline of diasporic engagement among three factors: diaspora policies of the standing state, the economic basis of exclave, and the organizational basis of exclave. The comparative study of Bassos and registry theoretically suggests that the impact of retreat of the diaspora process changes depending on the antecedent relationship between the economic and organizational basis of exclave. Under these conjunctural mechanisms, with varying patterns in the decline of diasporic engagement. So all in all, I proposed a conjunctural causal explanation for the decline of diasporic engagement by analyzing the comparative case of Kachimaki conflicts among Japanese migrants in Brazil. Thank you for your attention.
Pleasure to introduce next and third speaker for the session, Saki Kiki Miyazaki. She's a PhD candidate in the Graduate School of Social Sciences at the Hoover University in Tokyo, Japan. The title of her presentation is How the War Ended: Japanese Returnees in Hawaii in 1945.
Sorry. Good afternoon. My name is Saki Miyazaki. I am a PhD candidate at Stanford University in Tokyo and a adjunct researcher at the National Institute for Japanese Language and Linguistics. It is an honor to be here. Today, I will discuss Japanese repatriation from the continental US to Hawaii after World War II. I shall refer to Japanese and Japanese Americans in Hawaii as Japanese in Hawaii or Hawaii Japanese. We'll begin with a brief background of Hawaii Japanese before relevant literature. Afterwards, I shall explain what I found in the Hochi Shimbun digital collection. While the first Japanese immigration to the Hawaiian Kingdom, Gandemono, was in 1868, consistent Japanese immigration to the Hawaiian Kingdom began only in 1885. In 1920, the Japanese composed 43% of Hawaii's population. After the Immigration Act of 1924, new Japanese migrants were prohibited from entering Hawaii. However, as we say, the second generation US citizens were born. The Japanese population in Hawaii continued to grow. In 1940, the US Census revealed that there were approximately 126,000 Japanese in the continental US, but 158,000 in Hawaii, where they composed 37.9% of the latter's population. After World War II, the Japanese in Hawaii quickly gained political power. For example, in 1954, the Democratic Party won for the first time in Hawaii with several Japanese American politicians. Today, composing 22% of the total population, Hawaii Japanese are no longer the largest ethnic group. However, the Japanese in Hawaii have a higher median income than white households. This is unique to Hawaii. While they worked hard to ensure their status today, their success story differs from the experiences of Japanese Americans in the continental US. I believe the wartime and the post-war experience, post-war period explain the unique experiences of Japanese in Hawaii. The wartime history of the Japanese in Hawaii, especially regarding incarceration, has been gaining academic attention, beginning with the rediscovery of the Honolulu internment camp in 2002, where archaeological research began in 2006. Simultaneously, several works regarding internment in Hawaii were being published, mostly in Japanese. In 2020, Kaori Akiyama published Hawaii Nikkei no Kyosei Shuyoshi, The History of Japanese Internment in Hawaii, the most comprehensive work on Hawaii Japanese internment. Akiyama illustrated how the internment of the Japanese began, how the authority managed the camp, and how the camp was grown. While it depicted the history of Hawaii internment, what happened to the internees after the war remains unclear. In 2004, Noriko Shimada published Sensou to Imin no Shakaishi, Hawaii Nikkei Amerikajin no Taiheiyo Sensou, The Social History of War and Immigrants, the Pacific War of Japanese in Hawaii. In the book, she revealed how Hawaii Japanese reclaimed a Japanese culture after World War II, but did not explain what happened to the returnees. Next, we will discuss the events that transpired in Hawaii during World War II. Given that nearly 40% of Hawaii's entire population was Japanese, massive incarceration comparable to that on the West Coast on the continental US did not occur. Some Japanese, including deck workers and taxi and bus drivers, lost their job for quote-unquote security reasons, but the vast majority kept their jobs and houses during the war. However, some were arrested and incarcerated in the few camps available on the US continent or the Hawaiian Islands. Those captured in the initial stages were Japanese community leaders like Buddhist or Shinto priests, Japanese language teachers, journalists, and business leaders. Internees were incarcerated alone while their families stayed at home. Families were allowed to visit the internees. If the family became impoverished after the breadwinner's incarceration, they could go to the US mainland camp to be with the breadwinner. These people were called, quote unquote, voluntary internees. Some people were evicted from their houses too. These eviction occurred because Hawaii was where the enemy attacked, and the headquarters for the US military was on the island. Neighbors were kicked out without monetary compensation as the US military expanded facilities. Meanwhile, those sent off to the mainland camps returned to Hawaii beginning around September 1945. The term kifu, which means return to Hawaii, and the year 1945 in the Hoji Shimbun district collection yielded 53 hits for the Hawaii Times, also known as Nippu Jiji before the war, and 89 hits for the Hawaii Herald, which also known as Hawaii Hoji. The optical character reader, OCR, is not perfect. Some article might have been inadvertently excluded. The online collection of Nippu Jiji article was analyzed thoroughly. However, access to Hawaii Herald article was restricted, as headlines and data were examined online before selecting microfilms for viewing at the National Diaspora Library in Tokyo. As digital data are available, I will mainly show articles from Nippu Jiji in this presentation. As mentioned earlier, individuals began returning to Hawaii in September 1945. Therefore, the actual number of articles about returnees might be less. Around that time, local Japanese newspapers began publishing the names and addresses of returnees. In addition, returnees began running advertisements and publishing their memoirs to express their gratitude to the Japanese community in Hawaii. Even those who had not yet returned to Hawaii from the US continent share their experiences behind barbed wire or on their way home from the camps. Before discussing the post-war period, I shall describe how the Japanese in Hawaii perceived internees during the war. Sam Nishimura, Hawaii-born Nisei, was arrested on April 12, 1942, and incarcerated at Sand Island and Honolulu before being released in January 1944. Although the reason for his incarceration remained unclear, Nishimura and his family believed he was incarcerated because he signed a banknote for his father as part of a donation to purchase a truck for the Japanese Red Cross. In the oral history interview conducted in 1976 by the Center for Oral History at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, Nishimura shared how unwelcoming the community was to him. On this slide, the interviewer asked what people said to him when he left Honolulu in January 1944. Sam Nishimura, referred to as SM here, revealed that people were afraid to talk to him after his return. He also mentioned that his wife had a few visitors even during his incarceration. As mentioned before, the reason for Nishimura's incarceration was unclear to him and also to his neighbors and friends. Given that it was selective incarceration, those taken were considered suspicious. Some also reported questionable behavior in others. When Nishimura returned from the camp, the war was ongoing and the people in Hawaii were still living under the martial law. Thus, his friends and the neighbors did not want to give any reason to be taken to the camps. He speculated that many feared their loyalty would be questioned after meeting him. In the part of the interview that I have on this slide, Nishimura also speculates that his friend did not visit him when he returned from camp, as the war was still ongoing. Nishimura was a shop-owning tailor. After he was taken, his business closed. His family sold his tools so that they could move to the US continental camps to be with him. However, he he and his family were not sent to the continent. He said he had to buy, quote unquote, everything, but not a house or shop. He lost his steering tool. After he retrieves his tool, he was able to reopen his shop. His customers were mainly Filipinos who did not care whether Nishimura was incarcerated or not. So Nishimura added that the incarceration did not affect his business after his return. Compared to returnees from the camps on the US continent, Honolulu internees like Nishimura did not or were unable to share their experiences of incarceration. Their memoirs were not published in local Japanese newspaper until the 1980s, but that's another story. Now I shall share the case of Otokichi Ozaki, a Kochi-born Issei. He lived in Hilo on Hawaii Island, where he worked as a journalist and a language teacher. He was among the earliest to be arrested. After his arrest, he was sent to a Kilauea military camp on Hawaii Island and Sun Island on Oahu Island. In December 1942, after he was shuttled among camps in the continental US with 165 others from the second transfer group, Ozaki's family relocated to the continental US to be with him. The Ozaki family was reunited in the Jerome relocation camp in March 1944. They stayed until November 1945 at the Tule Lake Segregation Center. On this slide, I have a letter to Otokichi Ozaki from Ozaki's friend Kaneshiro in September 1945. In the letter, Kaneshiro said he could not write to Ozaki during the war as he was afraid of being taken into custody. When this letter was sent, Ozaki was still in the Tule Lake Segregation Center. However, when the war was over, Kaneshiro was able to write and mail this letter as he felt safe contacting internees. So according to Nishimura and Ozaki's cases, selective incarceration appears to have instilled fear among the Japanese community. Nobody knew why the internees were taken or what happened to them. Friends of internees likely wanted to know what happened to them, but were afraid of being taken into custody if they contacted internees. However, attitudes towards internees changed after the war. Now I shall discuss the return of the internees to Hawaii during the post-war period. In this presentation, I refer to them as returnees. This is an example of the memoirs/reports and the list of the returnees. This newspaper was published on December 8, 1945. The article in green includes the report from Jikai Yamasato, the Buddhist priest of Jikoen Honganji on the island of Oahu. Yamasato authored this report on December 3rd en route to California to board the ship to Hawaii. The article highlighted in red is the list of the returnees from the Santa Fe internment camp, including Yamasato, whose name appears on the left end of the top red square. They returned to Hawaii on the U.S. military troop ship Shawnee. According to the passenger list, the Shawnee left San Pedro, California on December 4th, the day after Yamasato drafted the report and sent it to the Hawaii Times. Yamazato's name on the passenger list is highlighted in red. The Hawaii Times also reported the arrival of the Shawnee in Honolulu on December 10th at 9 a.m. The Shawnee carried approximately 800 people, including returnees from the Santa Fe camp and Crystal City. The Hawaii Times article from December 6th also reports the Shawnee carried the Nisei soldiers returning from the battlefield to Hawaii. The article said it was like a little Hawaii because the troop ship was filled with people from Hawaii. The newspaper article also includes pictures of returnees and their families and the friends reuniting at the port. This group of 450 returnees came back to Hawaii aboard the Yama's ship in November 1945. These articles were published on November 14th. It is a bit difficult to see, but this article on the left shows 3 pictures. On the top left and top right, returnees are pictured getting off the ship and wearing nice suits. The bottom image shows those who gather to welcome the returnees. The article on the right shows the picture of returnees looking out from the ship. The rest is an extensive list of returnees, which includes their names and occupations. Here I have Hawaii Hoji published on the same day, November 14, 1945. You can see that they wear very nice suits and wearing lei clearly. These memoirs have been written by returnees. Both articles were published in November 1945. It might be hard to see, but you might notice that they are well dressed here too. The picture was taken in the camp. Most of the people sent to the camps on the U.S. continent were business leaders, Buddhist or Shinto priests, Japanese language teachers, or journalists. Because they were the community leaders and because they returned after the war, a part of the Japanese community in Hawaii welcomed their homecoming. Additionally, because some were journalists, their memoirs were published in the newspapers. Because mass incarceration did not happen and few people were incarcerated in Hawaii, the community was curious about what happened in the camps on the US continent. During the war, people were afraid to contact internees but remained curious about what happened to them. This may explain why so many reports/memoirs were published in the local Japanese newspapers. These are the example of thank you and greeting ads. Given that some of the returnees were business owners, they put ads in newspapers announcing their businesses reopening. On the left of the slide, I have one greeting ad by one Dr. Yanagi. He put this ad up to inform his patient of his return. On the right, I have thank you ads from returnees from Crystal City via troop ship journey. This is for people to know that they have returned home safely. Unlike Japanese Americans on the mainland who lost all their possessions and financial assets because of the eviction and the incarceration and had to rebuild their lives after the war, most Japanese in Hawaii, even those taken to the camps, they did not lose their homes or occupations. Given selective incarceration, if the CEO was taken away, a family member such as his son assumed the CEO position and ran the business until the returnees came back. The Japanese in Hawaii experienced selective rather than mass incarceration. During the war, people were unable to contact internees because they were afraid of being taken. Therefore, they did not know what had happened to them. After the war, the memoirs of the internees/returnees were valuable resources for the community. Given that the returnees were community leaders brought to the camps on the US continent, the community welcomed their return. Even though they were taken to the camps on the continent, their occupations remained unaffected. Unlike most of the Japanese Americans on the West Coast, because only people were taken, most of the Japanese in Hawaii did not lose everything. Even the Japanese community leaders who were taken to the camps had their homes and occupation to return. I assume this allowed Hawaii Japanese to quickly rebuild their lives after the war, followed by subsequent political and economic success. I would like to conduct additional research on this topic to bolster this argument. This marks the end of my presentation on the Japanese in Hawaii post-World War II. Mahalo nui loa for your kind attention.
I'd like to start by asking a couple of questions for clarification. Shinya, what you describe as the Japanese Americans' perception and rhetoric of concerning Chinese and China and Chinese people sound pretty much the same as the Japanese perception and rhetoric of China and Chinese people. Clarify as to differences and similarities between the two. Dr. Shibata, am I correct in understanding that the Japanese communities, Japanese migrant communities in Boston and Registro have since dissolved? Am I correct in understanding it? So, and to Miyazaki, did the local Japanese papers in the mainland US also carry information on Japanese returnees from internment camps?
Okay, thank you so much for your questions. And just to be clear, so your question is about how do I think about the difference and similarity between Japanese Americans, from China in America and Japanese Americans perceptions of China in Japan.
The Japanese people's perception of China and the Chinese people in the interwar period seem precisely the way you described with regard to the Japanese Americans in the US. So is there any substantial fundamental difference between the two people, Japanese in Japan on the one hand, and the Japanese Americans on the other hand, as to how they talked about, brotherhood, Asian brotherhood, Pan-Asianism, etc., with regard to China? I didn't quite see that. So.
Okay. Thank you for clarification. Yeah, that's a question. Well, that I'm thinking about as well. And it looks like there is the Japanese American, Japanese American and Japanese in Japan have much in common about the about China's view, because Japan and Chinese are the same. So to be honest, I couldn't see the difference between the Americans' perception of China and Japanese perception of China. But if I had to say difference, I'd like to say Japanese American pushed forward on the ground racial experience, and so that's why Japanese Americans said, okay, let's fight against the alien land bill, fight against the alien land bill, and let's fight against the fishery bill, because we have the same common ground as racialized minority in America. So I guess when it comes to Japanese Americans, their perception of China is their on ground experience of U.S. racism.
Thank you.
So in terms of even now, the Bastos in Bistro has a strong Japanese influence in the community. What I was saying is that the Bastos Registro has an X-ray, which has a strong connection to the homeland and almost non-connection to the host land. In that result, but still there are Japanese.
Oh, thank you so much. So if the local Japanese newspaper on the mainland US also carried the returnee story, I am not sure, to be honest, but I think it is very difficult to spot the article on the mainland newspaper, since I used Kifu as for my research, and Kifu is written into Hawaii, so it was really easy to locate, spot the articles. And I think it's there could be few articles, but since Hawaii didn't have a massive incarceration, and on the West Coast they experienced a massive incarceration, everyone was on the camps, and everyone returned to or resettle after the war. So I think they did not, or they might be it's going to be very low very small number of articles about like resettlement or we came back from the camps and stuff like that. Yes.
Thank you. So I'd like to take as many questions as possible. So those who have questions, raise your hand. Oh, a lot of you. So I guess let's pull all the questions because I want to hear all of them. So Rashad, Facundo, Andrew, and Andrew. Then I think.
Just give me.
So everybody.
I'll keep it short, but I have a question for each of you. Could you expand upon, I was interested about the YMCA connection, about people, can you expand upon that kind of institution as a way for going to China and kind of facilitating that exchange? And for the second presentation, you posited economics as like a, leading to conflict to a certain extent. Sorry to oversimplify, but could it be in reconciliation after this conflict? Could it be that economics also became the solution at the end, bringing people together, or how would you kind of play that narrative out into the post-conflict community? And a question for you, Kiki, about how would you weigh in terms of the lack of warm welcome for the people who were interned in Uli relative to those people who came from the mainland? How much is that really about their pre-war status as opposed to their experience specifically about being in Uli?
Okay, so please take notes and we'll take questions.
My first question for Yoshida-san was actually the same question that Dr. Totani asked, so I will let you elaborate on that question. And okay, it's the same experience as a racialized minority in the Japanese metropolitan discourse. For example, in political areas, you can say that many discourses also criticize like Anglo-British, like global racism against Japanese minorities in the colonies or in their territories. So that was also, I think, reproduced in a more global area or metropolitan area. So my question would be, how could you elaborate more on those ground experiences of racialization and discrimination in the US to give us a better understanding of their ground experiences and how that was different from, metropolitan discourses about like the Japanese people or nation or race as a racialized minority in the global area. But my question for you and for Shibata-san was very easy to understand your argument. And how would you compare from your thesis or your framework different Japanese communities with the same like Italian or German communities in Brazil at the time of the war? Were there also inter-ethnic conflicts, or if they happen, do you think your framework will still be useful to analyze why these conflicts happened or not, or what kind of insights you can give from using your argument or your framework to compare other communities in Brazil at that time? And for Miyazaki-san, I was very intrigued to know that one of the cases you mentioned of the returnees, Nishimura-san was able to return to Hawaii in 1944 when the war was in its highest point. So I wanted to know why he was able to return at that time. Was that a common thing? There are other cases like that. It was an exception, and I think it gives what's a question related to the title of your presentation: how the war ended for those people who returned when the war was still going on. What kind of insight we can get?
Excellent.
I'll pass and ask questions later. Thank you. 2 short questions. First, for Dr. Shibata, I'm sure you brought this up and I must have just missed it, but why did the decline of diasporic engagement manifest a lot in conflict along Kachimaki lines and not, say, class lines or some other demographic distinction? And then for Shinya, following up on Professor Totani's question, What do you think informs the perceptions of Japanese Americans vis-a-vis Chinese, and why were they so similar to Japan? Are they just taking their perceptions from pre-immigration lifetime or their families, or is there a strong engagement with metropolitan discourse? I'd be interested to know your theories about.
I'd like to continue hearing questions.
I have a question to all three speakers about the related to media. For Yoshida-san, when you say the Japanese Americans' perception towards China or Chinese, it seems like I want to know who were Japanese Americans? Like, there is a diversity within Japanese American community, and you refer to Japanese language newspaper and English language section of the Japanese community newspaper. It seems like directed to the English-speaking Nisei generation. I want to ask you about some kind of linguistic diversity within the Japanese American community. And also Shibata-san, I'm not really familiar with the Kachimaki conflict, but I want to know about the influence of the media, the role of the Japanese community media during the conflict. And for Miyazaki-san, you picked the term kifu. This is from Japanese language. And I wonder how the English section of the Japanese community newspapers carried talking about returnees.
I had a question for Yoshida-san. I'm also wondering, kind of, the people that you're writing about, the Japanese Americans, are living in kind of areas that have large Asian populations in general, and what sorts of effects or maybe intra-Asian kind of community ties there were between Japanese Americans and, say, Chinese Americans in San Francisco, and how that might have either affected positively or negatively their understandings of Chinese in Asia.
I have two questions for Yoshida-san. Thank you so very much for your excellent presentation, and it was very interesting. And actually, I'm bad at listening to English, so I'm not sure if I understand your presentation correctly. And also, I'm not researching on history, so I apologize if my question is relevant in advance. And one question is, before Imperial Japan set up ideas such as the New East Asia Order or the Greater East Asia Prophecy here, I'm not sure how we call that, did the idea of Asia for Asians already emerge among the Japanese Americans? In other words, did it already appear in Japanese American newspapers even around the time of the Manchurian incident or the Shanghai incident? Were there any orders from the Imperial Japanese government to write such content? And another question is that I think there were groups of Japanese Americans, especially on the West Coast, who were involved in the labor movement. For example, there was Fuji, who organized a newspaper called Doho. I think that was the official newspaper of the Japanese section of the Communist Party of the United States, what we call CPUSA. And besides Fuji, there was also Koide Nobumiki, Ayako Ishigaki, Nobu Karyoneda, and so on. And these Japanese immigrants who were passionate about the labor movement were very enthusiastic about reflecting propaganda against Japanese expansion into China. And my question is, do you know if the perception of the Chinese people changed for these left-wing Japanese American before and after the Manchurian incident or the Marco Polo Bridge, local Kyojiken? Or do you know if there were any similarities or differences in the image of the Chinese in the concept of Asians for Asians by among those Japanese Americans?
So there are a lot of questions, but I I guess we'll start with Dr. Shibata.
Okay, the first question, so the post-conflict reconciliation, I mean, frankly speaking, I haven't looked at the post-conflict process, but in the general historiography of Kachimaki conflict, also the reconciliation process is understood in a general way, like Japanese migrants reconciliation because of as they are integrated in the Brazilian society, then they gradually make blah, blah, blah. But I also doubt that that kind of general narrative of the negotiation, as you suggested, probably it might be an interesting idea to look at how the negotiation process well happened and then how they worked in some aspect. That is good research on that.
I don't want to give you more work.
And then I think the comparative framework. So simply speaking, the Italian and German case, in the cases, German and Italian case, they don't have internal conflict so much. But I studied the Japanese case within case because I thought that I can control other factors. But as a Japanese migrant, they have we can assume the similar cultural background, and then that I can control other factors, so that I look at the intra-group conflicts. So I don't know how much I can expand this framework to study Italian, or German migrant. Let me think about it. And then media. To be honest, I'm not still sure about your question. So it's response to the sound question. And then in terms of media, under the restrictive process of President about government, basically all newspapers and all official media are prohibited. So Japanese migrants have developed an informal. And then the last question, can you explain your? I mean, you are asking that there are several other dimensions like class conflicts.
Yeah, so you started with the Kachimaki conflict as a point of focus, and you explained why it arose in a certain district of Sao Paulo, but not the other, as a function of the decline of diasporic engagement. The decline of diasporic engagement seemed closely tied to changing economic reality in those areas. And so I'm kind of looking at the reverse analysis. Why did that manifest as a Kachimaki conflict and not along some other social lines, like say class, for example?
No, I don't have it. I don't have a good answer. But what I can say is that in the pre-war period, already the class differentiation between among the Japanese migrants already emerged. And then in the pre-war period, still they had a social separation. They maintained some integration, internal integration in the community. So, however, when the Japanese diaspora process retreated from Brazil, so that the integration process started. So, I don't know. This can be an answer to your question. What I can say now is.
That was an excellent question. How about you, Vicky? Could you respond to the questions?
I'll combine my answer to you, Asher and Garcino-san. But I'm not a professional about the internet history. But I believe those who were sent to the mainland U.S. were taken in the early stages, and they had a higher economic status than the Honolulu internees, because FBI had the list of the names even before the war started, and So Japanese in Hawaii was being, and also the Japanese in Hawaii were being arrested throughout the whole time. So so they just so the only one the people who got arrested early stages, they got sent to the mainland camp. But the people who were arrested at the later stages, they just stayed in Honolulu, and they were questioned their suspicious behavior. But again, we don't know the clear answer for the clear reasons for why they are being taken. And they were just questioned in the internment camp, and if they were, I don't know, if they were proved to be, not suspicious, they get released even during the war. So Nishimura's case was, I think, in Honolulu, it's not unusual. It's just common, just normal thing. He was not suspicious enough to be held in the camp, so he was released. So that is my answer to you. And for the Tsukuda sensei's question, I only look up the Japanese section, so I didn't do the research on the English section, but I went through the microfilms of the Hawaii Hochi, and they had English section. So I try to research it, and I mean they have like English section and a Japanese section, but that doesn't like have the same exact articles and stuff. But some issues had like couple pictures of returnees and stuff, and they don't say returnees, of course. They say returns of internees and stuff. So they celebrated their returns to Hawaii even in English section. So, but I should look up more. So thank you so much. So that'll be all.
Okay. To be honest, I feel stuck. With so many questions from audience.
You've got 5 minutes.
Okay. Let me answer to the question. Easy to. Okay. Let me respond to the easy to answer question with Professor Tsukuda. I guess you addressed the matter. I guess language is very important, factor to consider Japanese Americans, questions of Chinese and China. And actually, the discourse and contents of Pan-Asian varies, depends on the context. So it should be contextualized more. And actually, to the best of my knowledge, based on my reading of primary sources so far, I guess in English language Japanese newspaper, I have not yet confirmed that the English language newspaper address the racial sameness or the racial solidarity in Japan and China. But on the other hand, Japanese language community newspaper, just like I explained, frequently address the racial sameness with Chinese. So so I guess Japanese American, the essay so actually we can't lump up together the different, very different actors of Japanese American. So one thing that I can say for sure is that individual Japanese change their discourse of Pan-Asian to different audiences accordingly. So that sense language is crucial. And the same instead of the question from Professor Dekro, and I guess the intra-ethnic relations between specific local context, like you mentioned San Francisco, right? And I guess intra-ethnic relations, I guess less attention is paid to intra-ethnic relations between Chinese and Japanese in San Francisco, based on my literature review. And the interesting finding that the finding that I feel interesting is that Japanese and Chinese have the because they have they can read the Chinese character, right? So the Chinese read the Japanese language newspaper, and the Japanese immigrants, especially Issei, read as well the Chinese language community newspaper. So in they are used the Chinese character kanji or Chinese Hanyu. So on the bit, I guess in that sense, the language is a common ground to connect to Japanese American, Chinese American with each other, and that which might have paved the way for the Asian solidarity. Plus, in the context of the U.S. racism, and Russia. Okay, I would like to respond to your questions. And actually, I have to investigate more about the what's the connection of the American YMCA and Shanghai's Euro-American run YMCA. But so but I guess my educated guess is that the more I committed myself into the primary sources related to the YMCA in China, the more cases I believe I can find. So in the other okay, that's my answer. But for the moment, I'm not sure my question is in line with your expectations. So sorry.
So we've got questions from Facundo and Andrew regarding racial discrimination on the ground. They wanted you to a little bit more on that as the context of the discourse that you said your knowledge on with us.
I need to consider more about this point. Well, just like you addressed, earlier, how we should consider the difference and similarities of this Americans' perception of China and this perception of China in Japan. So okay, let me take it. See that.
So let's carry this on to a discussion after this session.
Okay.
And thank you all for your participation, and thank you to the three speakers.